The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the vicarage garden as St. Mary Mead prepared for its annual summer garden party, an event that had marked the social pinnacle of village life for more years than anyone cared to count. Paper lanterns swayed gently between the ancient elm trees, their soft light beginning to compete with the fading daylight, while trestle tables groaned under the weight of Mrs. Carmichael's legendary Victoria sponge. Jam tarts that gleamed like rubies, and delicate cucumber sandwiches cut with mathematical precision. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary spot beneath the spreading cedar tree, her knitting needles clicking with gentle rhythm as she observed the familiar tableau unfolding before her. At 72, she had learned that life's most revealing moments often occurred not in the bright center of events, but in the quiet margins where people believed themselves unobserved. Her mild blue eyes, deceptively gentle behind wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing of the intricate social dance playing out across the lawn. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a flowing floral dress that seemed to echo the garden itself, moved between the guests with practiced grace, her laughter carrying easily across the gathering. Her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, stood near the rose garden in animated discussion with Dr. Geoffrey Haydock about the merits of the various entries in the giant marrow competition, his military bearing softened by retirement, but his opinions as firm as ever. The new bank manager, Mr. Clement Fortescue, had positioned himself strategically near the refreshment table, his calculating gaze suggesting he viewed even social gatherings as opportunities for advancement. The vicar, dear Mr. Leonard Clement, fluttered between groups with his characteristic mixture of genuine warmth and clerical anxiety, his cassock slightly askew from his earlier attempts to organize the children's games. His wife, Griselda, had emerged from behind a magnificent rhododendron bush, where she had been arranging the final touches on the evening's centerpiece. An elaborate crystal punch bowl filled with her grandmother's recipe for elderflower cordial, its pale golden surface reflecting the lantern light like liquid sunshine. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tensions that rippled beneath the surface of village politeness. Mrs. Caroline Weatherby, the doctor's wife, maintained her usual position of social authority near the cake stall, but her smile seemed strained as she watched Mr. Fortescue's rather obvious attempts to ingratiate himself with the more prominent villagers. Young Timothy Radford, recently returned from university with modern ideas that occasionally scandalized his elders, stood in animated conversation with Miss Lavinia Fullerton, whose sharp tongue was legendary throughout the county. The school mistress, Miss Hartnell, observed the proceedings with her characteristic air of disapproval as if the very act of enjoyment was somehow morally suspect. As twilight deepened, Griselda called for attention, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. The guests naturally gravitated toward the central lawn, where she stood beside her precious punch bowl, ladle poised with ceremonial importance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with theatrical flair, "before we begin the evening's entertainment, I thought we might all share a toast with my grandmother's elderflower cordial. The recipe has been in our family for 3 generations, and I do hope you'll find it refreshing." Miss Marple accepted her delicate glass with appropriate gratitude, noting the cordial's subtle floral bouquet and the way the liquid caught the lantern light. Around her, the other guests murmured appreciative comments, though she observed that Mr. Fortescue seemed more interested in the crystal bowl itself than its contents, while Mrs. Weatherby took only the smallest sip before setting her glass aside with a slight grimace. The atmosphere grew increasingly convivial as the special drink was consumed, with several guests requesting the recipe, only to be gently rebuffed by Griselda with promises that some family secrets must remain inviolate. Colonel Bantry proposed a toast to their gracious hostess, and glasses were raised in unanimous appreciation. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the first subtle sign of distress. Dr. Haydock, who had been engaged in his usual robust debate about horticultural matters, suddenly paused mid-sentence and pressed his hand to his forehead. His ruddy complexion had taken on an alarming pallor, and beads of perspiration appeared despite the pleasant evening temperature. Mrs. Weatherby, with the instincts of a medical professional's wife, moved immediately to his side, but before she could reach him, the doctor collapsed onto the carefully manicured lawn, his body convulsing with frightening violence. The cheerful party atmosphere evaporated, as if someone had extinguished all the lanterns at once. Guests gathered around the stricken man, their voices rising in alarm and confusion, while Griselda took charge with admirable composure, directing someone to telephone for an ambulance. Miss Marple remained slightly apart from the immediate circle of helpers, her observant gaze taking in not just the victim, but the reactions of those around him. The genuine shock on most faces, the way Mrs. Weatherby's professional calm barely concealed her terror, and the particular pallor that had overcome young Timothy as he knelt to offer assistance. Within minutes, Dr. Haydock's convulsions ceased, but not in the way anyone had hoped. His breathing stopped, and despite desperate attempts at resuscitation, it became clear that the beloved village doctor had died. The word poison hung unspoken in the evening air, transforming Griselda's elegant elderflower cordial from a symbol of hospitality into an instrument of death in the peaceful summer garden party into the scene of what would undoubtedly prove to be murder most foul. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, its harsh siren cutting through the evening air like a blade, though everyone present understood it was far too late for Dr. Geoffrey Haydock. Constable Frank Polk, St. Mary Mead's sole representative of law enforcement, had appeared shortly after the emergency call, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by grim determination as he began the delicate task of securing what had clearly become a crime scene. The guests found themselves transformed from celebrants into witnesses, their cheerful party attire suddenly seeming grotesquely inappropriate for the gravity of the situation unfolding on the vicarage lawn. Miss Marple remained in her position beneath the cedar tree, her knitting needles now still in her lap as she observed the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself not in grand gestures but in the smallest details. She noted how Mrs. Weatherby had instinctively taken charge of comforting the more distressed guests, her medical knowledge making her invaluable in the immediate aftermath, while Colonel Bantry stood rigidly at attention, his military training asserting itself in crisis. Young Timothy Radford had retreated to the shadows near the elm trees, his face bearing an expression of shock that seemed almost excessive for someone who had known the doctor only casually through village encounters. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham as the last traces of sunset faded from the sky, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was a man who prided himself on swift resolutions, his broad frame and decisive manner suggesting someone unaccustomed to prolonged mysteries. After a brief consultation with the police surgeon who had followed in his wake, Inspector Slack surveyed the scene with professional efficiency, his sharp eyes taking in the scattered glasses, the ornate crystal punch bowl still half full of its deadly contents, and the anxious faces of the assembled villagers. "Now then," Inspector Slack announced, his voice carrying the authority of Scotland Yard training. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first, let me establish the basic facts. The deceased consumed this elderflower cordial, along with the rest of you, and within minutes he was dead. That suggests a fast-acting poison, probably something that could be easily dissolved without altering the taste significantly." Griselda stepped forward, her earlier composure beginning to crack under the weight of implications. "Inspector, I must tell you that I prepared that cordial myself this afternoon using my grandmother's recipe, exactly as I have for years. I drank from it myself, as did everyone here. Oh, if there was poison in the entire bowl, we should all be affected." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this crucial observation. Indeed, the selective nature of the poisoning presented a fascinating puzzle. She had observed Dr. Haydock drinking from his glass with apparent enjoyment, and she distinctly remembered him requesting a second serving, which Griselda had provided with obvious pleasure. The doctor had been particularly complimentary about the cordial's delicate flavor, even asking about the specific elderflowers used in its preparation. Inspector Slack seized upon this detail immediately. A second serving, you say? That's significant. Mrs. Clement, I'll need you to walk me through exactly how you served the cordial. Did you use the same ladle for everyone? Did anyone else have access to the bowl between servings? As Griselda began to recount the evening's events, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest. She noticed that when Griselda had lifted the ladle earlier, there had been the faintest smear of something pale on the handle. A ghost of powder, perhaps, though it could have been merely residue from the lemon slices. More intriguing was the way Timothy's face had grown even paler at the inspector's questions, his hands trembling slightly as he kept glancing toward the garden gate as if contemplating escape. Mrs. Weatherby cleared her throat with obvious reluctance. Inspector, I feel I must mention something that may be relevant. Geoffrey had been receiving some rather unpleasant correspondence lately. Anonymous letters making accusations about his professional conduct. He was quite distressed by them, though he tried to hide it from the village. This revelation sent a visible ripple through the assembled guests. Miss Marple observed with particular interest how each person reacted to this new information. Griselda's eyes widened with genuine surprise, while Colonel Bantry's expression grew thunderous at the suggestion that anyone would dare malign the doctor's reputation. Mr. Fortescue, however, seemed less surprised than the others, his calculating gaze moving from face to face as if assessing how this development might affect his own standing in the community. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose with obvious satisfaction. Anonymous letters, you say? That puts quite a different complexion on things. Blackmail, professional jealousy, damaged reputations. These are classic motives for murder. Mrs. Weatherby, do you happen to know what these accusations concerned? The doctor's widow hesitated visibly before answering. They suggested improprieties in his treatment of certain patients. Completely unfounded, of course, but Geoffrey was terrified that such rumors might destroy his practice and his standing in the community. He'd worked so hard to build his reputation here. Young Timothy's reaction to this revelation was particularly striking. He seemed to shrink further into the shadows, and Miss Marple noticed his right hand unconsciously covering his left wrist, as if protecting something there. When Inspector Slack's gaze fell upon him, Timothy's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I did have a consultation with Dr. Haydock recently, sir. A private matter. The inspector's tone sharpened with interest. And what sort of private matter would that be, Mr. Radford? Before Timothy could answer, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught another detail that would have escaped most observers. Griselda's white gloves, which she had worn earlier in the evening but removed before serving the cordial, lay folded on the windowsill behind the rhododendron bush with a small, neat crease, as if they had been handled by careful, methodical fingers after being discarded. As the evening wore on and statements were taken, the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead found itself transformed into a web of suspicion and whispered theories, each resident wondering if the person they had known for years might be capable of such calculated evil. The drawing room of the vicarage, hastily transformed into an interview space, held an atmosphere of strained civility as Inspector Slack methodically worked through his list of witnesses. The cheerful chintz furniture and family photographs seemed to mock the gravity of the proceedings, while Constable Polk moved about with solemn efficiency, carefully cataloguing every glass and utensil that might hold traces of the deadly poison. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needle still for once, though her observant blue eyes missed nothing of the human drama unfolding before her. Timothy Radford's interview proved particularly illuminating, though perhaps not in the ways Inspector Slack anticipated. The young man stood rigidly by the mantelpiece, his face bearing the pallor of someone wrestling with secrets too heavy to carry alone. When pressed about his private consultation with Dr. Haydock, his words came haltingly, each phrase carefully chosen to reveal just enough truth to satisfy official inquiry while concealing deeper implications. "It concerned a prescription, Inspector," Timothy finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I required but couldn't obtain through conventional channels." Dr. Haydock was understanding about certain conditions that affect young men, particularly those who've been exposed to different pressures at university. Miss Marple noted with interest how Timothy's carefully ambiguous phrasing managed to suggest impropriety without specifying its nature. She had observed enough human behavior to recognize the particular shame that accompanied certain modern afflictions and the desperate measures young people sometimes took to address them privately. More intriguingly, she noticed the way Timothy unconsciously covered his left wrist with his right hand, as if protecting something there, and the faint blue stains on his fingertips that suggested recent contact with ink. Mrs. Weatherby's sharp intake of breath indicated she grasped the implications immediately. "Inspector, if Jeffrey was providing medications outside normal protocols, that would certainly explain those dreadful anonymous letters. There are always those who take malicious pleasure in exposing what they perceive as moral failings, regardless of the compassionate intentions behind them." Before Inspector Slack could pursue this line of inquiry further, Mr. Fortescue cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. "Inspector, I feel I must mention something that may be relevant. Dr. Haydock had recently made some significant financial arrangements through the bank. Nothing improper, you understand, but substantial enough to suggest he was planning major changes in his circumstances. He seemed quite relieved about resolving some pressing obligations." This revelation cast the doctor's earlier jubilant mood in a new light. Miss Marple recalled how animated Dr. Haydock had seemed during the party, almost celebratory, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The contrast between his apparent relief and his subsequent murder suggested a cruel irony that someone who believed his troubles were ending had instead met his end. As the interviews continued, Miss Marple found herself drawn to examine the scene more closely. During a brief recess, she stepped onto the terrace under the pretense of retrieving her forgotten shawl. The evening air carried the lingering scent of elderflower and roses, now forever tainted by tragedy. Near the rhododendron bush where she had observed the folded gloves earlier, something caught her attention among the trampled grass. A tiny twist of white paper, the sort village chemists used for powder measures, partially hidden beneath fallen petals. "Constable Polk," she called gently, "I believe you might find this interesting." The young constable hurried over and carefully retrieved the paper twist with obvious excitement. "Evidence, Miss Marple. The killer must have dropped it when preparing the poison." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though she noticed something that gave her pause. The paper bore the distinctive watermark of Jameson's Pharmacy in Much Benham, not the local chemist shop where most villagers obtained their medicines. Someone had traveled some distance to acquire whatever powder this had contained, suggesting premeditation rather than a crime of sudden passion. When the interviews resumed, Inspector Slack's questioning took on renewed intensity. He had clearly decided that Timothy represented his most promising lead, and his questions grew increasingly pointed about the young man's movements throughout the evening and his access to the cordial. Timothy's responses became more evasive, his nervous gestures more pronounced, particularly the way he kept adjusting his left cuff as if concealing something beneath. "Mr. Radford," Inspector Slack pressed, "I need you to account for every moment you spent near that punch bowl. Did you assist Mrs. Clement with the serving? Did you have any opportunity to add something to the cordial?" "I helped carry some glasses earlier in the evening," Timothy admitted reluctantly. "Mrs. Clement was very gracious about accepting assistance, but I never touched the cordial itself, Inspector. I wouldn't know the first thing about poisons." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing concern, not because she doubted Timothy's potential guilt, but because she recognized the signs of a young man being driven toward a confession that might not reflect the complete truth. She had seen enough investigations to know that obvious suspects often serve to obscure more subtle forms of guilt, and Timothy's nervous behavior, while certainly suspicious, struck her as more consistent with shame than murderous intent. The evening's revelations had certainly provided Inspector Slack with a compelling narrative. A troubled young man seeking irregular medical treatment, anonymous letters threatening to expose improper practices, and clear opportunity to tamper with the victim's drink. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by elements that didn't quite fit this tidy explanation. The doctor's apparent relief and financial arrangements suggested someone who believed his problems were resolved, not someone facing imminent exposure. The careful folding of Griselda's gloves indicated methodical preparation, while the chemist's paper from Much Benham suggested planning that extended beyond the immediate village. As the clock struck 11 and the interviews finally concluded, Inspector Slack appeared satisfied with his progress. Timothy would remain under close observation, the anonymous letters would be examined for handwriting analysis, and the physical evidence would be processed by the forensic team. The case seemed to be proceeding along predictable lines, with a clear suspect and compelling motive emerging from the village's carefully maintained facade of respectability. Yet as Miss Marple prepared to depart with Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, she found herself reflecting on the curious nature of human behavior under stress. Timothy's obvious distress and suspicious actions certainly marked him as someone with secrets to hide, but she had learned that the most dangerous criminals often presented the most innocent facades. The true killer might well be someone who had sat calmly through the evening's questioning, offering helpful observations while concealing a heart capable of calculated murder. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy quiet as its residents contemplated the shocking transformation of their summer garden party into a scene of violent death, unaware that the most crucial revelations were yet to come. The gray morning mist that settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to carry whispers of scandal and speculation from cottage to cottage, transforming the peaceful village into a hive of nervous energy. At Mrs. Price's shop, the morning's customers lingered longer than necessary, their voices dropping to conspiratorial murmurs as they dissected every detail of the previous evening's tragedy. The consensus was remarkably uniform. Young Timothy Radford, with his modern university ideas and secretive medical consultations, had clearly poisoned Dr. Haydock to prevent exposure of some shameful secret. Miss Marple observed this collective rush to judgment with the quiet skepticism of someone who had witnessed human nature's tendency to embrace simple explanations for complex crimes. After purchasing wool she didn't particularly need, she made her way to the vicarage, where she found Griselda pale but determined to restore some semblance of normalcy to her disrupted household. The garden presented a melancholy sight in the morning drizzle, with sodden paper lanterns hanging like funeral decorations between the ancient elms. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently as they worked to clear away the remnants of celebration, "I wonder if you might walk me through exactly how the cordial was served yesterday evening. The smallest details often prove most illuminating." Griselda's recollection was precise despite her distress. She had prepared the elderflower cordial, using her grandmother's traditional recipe, picking the flowers herself that morning from the bush by the churchyard wall. The serving had been informal, with guests helping themselves to glasses from a tray near the sundial, while she ladled the cordial from her precious crystal bowl. Dr. Haydock had been particularly enthusiastic, complimenting the delicate flavor and specifically requesting a second serving. Miss Marple paused by the sundial, noting a pale crescent mark on its bronze surface where a damp glass had rested and dried. "Did people tend to keep the same glass when they returned for more?" she inquired with apparent casualness. "Some did, I think. It was all quite informal. Oh, but Inspector Slack mentioned that a glass was missing when they counted them afterward." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. She examined the ground near the elm trees where Timothy had stood, discovering a patch of flattened clover and a pale oval imprint where a glass had sat long enough to leave its mark. More intriguingly, her gardener's nose detected a faint medicinal tang lingering among the sweeter scents of elderflower and roses, something acrid that didn't belong to the innocent cordial. Inspector Slack arrived as they completed their examination, his bearing suggesting considerable satisfaction with his investigation's progress. Mrs. Clement, I'm pleased to report significant developments. The forensic analysis confirms the presence of aconitine, a highly toxic alkaloid derived from monkshood. It's a sophisticated poison, requiring considerable botanical knowledge to prepare properly. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this revelation. Aconitine was indeed a murderer's poison of choice for someone with scientific education, but its selection seemed almost too convenient for incriminating Timothy. Inspector, might I ask whether the poison was distributed evenly throughout the cordial? Localized concentration, Miss Marple. Whoever added the aconitine did so selectively, which explains why Dr. Haydock was the only victim despite everyone drinking from the same source. This confirmation supported Miss Marple's growing theory about the method employed. The selective contamination suggested intimate knowledge of the serving process and careful observation of Dr. Haydock's habits. She recalled how the doctor had set his first glass on the sundial during the toast, then returned by instinct to reclaim it rather than taking a fresh glass from the tray. A poisoner who understood this habit could have easily contaminated a single glass during the moment of general distraction. After Inspector Slack departed to continue building his case against Timothy, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby, who received her in a neat parlor that smelled of lavender and grief. The doctor's widow showed her the anonymous letters that had so distressed her husband, typed messages on good paper, addressed in old-fashioned blue ink with a faint scent of violet perfume. The progression was telling. Accusations of moral laxity, improper prescriptions, and finally a stark warning that he would be unmasked. Geoffrey was arranging his affairs with the bank, Mrs. Weatherby explained through barely controlled tears. Mr. Fortescue had consolidated a loan this week. Geoffrey said he could finally see a way out of his troubles. He seemed almost relieved yesterday afternoon despite that dreadful quarrel with Miss Hartnell about the school vaccinations. Miss Marple found Timothy waiting uncertainly by Mrs. Weatherby's garden gate, his face bearing the particular pallor of someone wrestling with secrets too heavy to carry. His explanation of his medical consultation was carefully ambiguous, suggesting the sort of private shame that drove young men to seek discreet treatment. The blue stains on his fingertips, she noted, were consistent with fountain pen ink rather than chemical residue, and his protective gesture toward his left wrist spoke of medical embarrassment rather than murderous guilt. A brief visit to Miss Hartnell revealed a woman whose rigid moral certainty had recently been challenged by what she perceived as Dr. Haydock's professional laxity. Her sitting room contained a respectable typewriter with a distinctive jumping E and a bottle of good blue ink from Jameson's Pharmacy in Much Benham, the same establishment that had produced the paper twist found near the rhododendron bush. As Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind worked methodically through the evidence. The case against Timothy was certainly compelling on the surface, but it possessed the fatal flaw of being too perfectly constructed. The real murderer, she suspected, was someone who understood both the art of misdirection and the psychology of village life. Someone who could plant evidence while appearing to assist the investigation. Someone whose moral certainty might justify murder as a form of divine justice. The truth lay not in the obvious clues pointing toward Timothy Radford, but in the subtle inconsistencies that revealed a more calculating mind at work. The morning brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when scandal has taken root overnight. At Mrs. Price's shop, the usual morning customers lingered with unusual purpose, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers as they dissected every detail of the previous evening's tragedy. The consensus was remarkably uniform and swift. Young Timothy Radford, with his secretive medical consultations and obvious distress, had clearly poisoned Dr. Haydock to prevent some shameful exposure. Miss Marple observed this collective rush to judgment with the quiet skepticism of someone who had witnessed human nature's tendency to embrace the most convenient explanations for complex crimes. She had learned long ago that the most obvious suspect often served to obscure more subtle forms of guilt, and Timothy's nervous behavior, while certainly suspicious, struck her as more consistent with shame than murderous calculation. Her first call was to the vicarage, where she found Griselda pale but determined to restore some semblance of normalcy to her disrupted household. The young woman's distress was evident, but Miss Marple noted with interest how she maintained her characteristic attention to detail even under such circumstances. When questioned about the evening's serving arrangements, Griselda's recollection was precise. She had ladled the cordial herself. Guests had helped themselves to glasses from a tray, and Dr. Haydock had been particularly enthusiastic, specifically requesting a second serving. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "Inspector Slack mentioned that a glass was missing when they counted them afterward. Do you recall anything about that?" Griselda's brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Yes, poor Edna has been quite distraught about it. She's convinced she miscounted, but I distinctly remember seeing Dr. Haydock set his first glass on the sundial during the toast, then return to collect it rather than taking a fresh one from the tray." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. A poisoner who understood this habit could have easily contaminated a single glass during the moment of general distraction, knowing that Dr. Haydock would return to claim it. The selective nature of the poisoning suggested intimate knowledge of the victim's behavior patterns. Edna, the vicarage maid, proved to be a treasure trove of overlooked observations. When Miss Marple gently questioned her about the missing glass, the girl's face brightened with relief at finally having someone listen to her concerns. "Oh, Miss Marple, I did find something peculiar this morning," Edna confided, leading them to the narrow path behind the kitchen garden. "There were bits of broken glass by the gooseberry bush, like someone had dropped a glass and swept the pieces under the leaves. I cleaned it up first thing so no one would be hurt, but there was a funny smell. Sharp and medicinal. Not like the elderflower at all." The broken glass, carefully retrieved from the dustbin, bore traces of that distinctive medicinal scent. Miss Marple examined the fragments with growing interest, noting their clean edges and the way they had been deliberately concealed rather than accidentally dropped. Someone had taken considerable care to dispose of the evidence, suggesting premeditation rather than panic. A visit to Jameson's pharmacy in Much Benham proved equally illuminating. Mr. Jameson, a neat and precise man with the discretion that came from years of handling village secrets, received Miss Marple with the respect reserved for certain elderly ladies whose questions were always perfectly reasonable until they revealed deeper purposes. "I wonder," Miss Marple said with apparent casualness, "whether people still request the old botanical preparations these days. Aconitine liniment, for instance. One heard of it so much in former times for neuralgia." Mr. Jameson's expression tightened slightly. "It's seldom ordered now, madam. Quite dangerous if misused. I keep only a small quantity under lock and key, though curiously I did have a request for it just last week. A gentleman from St. Mary Mead, very particular about the external use only labeling. Paid in cash and wore gloves, which struck me as odd for such warm weather. He also purchased blue writing ink and violet essence, mentioning they were for his aunt." The combination of details, gloves in warm weather, the specific location, the violet essence that matched the scent on the anonymous letters, painted a picture of careful planning. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Jameson courteously, her mind already working to fit this new information into the emerging pattern. Her subsequent investigation into Dr. Haydock's recent circumstances revealed a man who had been on the verge of resolving his difficulties rather than facing exposure. Mr. Fortescue at the bank confirmed that the doctor had recently secured a substantial loan and completed the sale of family property, entirely clearing his debts. Far from being desperate, Dr. Haydock had been jubilant about his financial recovery. This revelation significantly undermined the supposed motive for Timothy's crime. If the doctor's troubles were ending, why would the young man risk murder to prevent exposure? The timing suggested that someone else had been threatened by Dr. Haydock's newfound security and relief. Miss Marple's attention turned increasingly to the methodical nature of the crime. The careful selection of aconitine, the intimate knowledge of Dr. Haydock's habits, the deliberate disposal of evidence, and the sophisticated misdirection toward Timothy all pointed to a mind that operated with calculated precision. The killer had not acted in passion, but had planned, each detail with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to organizing complex undertakings. As she walked home through the village lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of evil that could hide behind facades of respectability and moral authority. The true murderer was someone who understood both the art of misdirection and the psychology of village life. Someone who could plant evidence while appearing to assist the investigation. Someone whose position in the community provided both opportunity and cover. The missing glass, the gloved purchaser, the violet-scented letters, and the careful timing all pointed toward a killer who was still moving freely among them, hidden behind a mask of helpful cooperation and righteous indignation. The most dangerous criminals, Miss Marple knew, were often those who believed their actions were justified by a higher moral purpose, and she suspected that the true perpetrator of Dr. Haydock's murder was someone who had convinced themselves that they were serving justice rather than committing it. The grey morning that settled over St. Mary Mead carried with it an atmosphere of collective certainty that Miss Marple found deeply troubling. Inspector Slack's satisfaction had ripened into something approaching triumph as new evidence continued to surface, each piece seemingly confirming Timothy Radford's guilt with mathematical precision. The young man's nervous behavior, his secretive medical consultations, and now the discovery of incriminating materials in his lodgings had created a narrative so compelling that the village had embraced it with visible relief. Miss Marple observed this rush to judgment with the quiet skepticism of someone who had learned that truth rarely presented itself in such convenient packages. She made her way to the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver a jar of black-currant jam to the still-shaken Griselda, but in reality to examine the scene once more with the benefit of fresh revelations. The morning light revealed details that had been obscured by the previous evening's lanterns and chaos, particularly the faint circular mark on the bronze sundial where Dr. Haydock had habitually placed his glass. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently as she helped Griselda clear away the last remnants of the ill-fated party, "Inspector Slack seems quite convinced he has his man. Yet I find myself troubled by small inconsistencies. Truth, in my experience, rarely insists on such attractive symmetry." Griselda paused in her tidying, her face reflecting the strain of the past day's events. "Miss Marple, there's something I should have mentioned earlier. During Colonel Bantry's toast, when everyone's attention was focused on his speech, I noticed someone moving near the sundial. They were partially concealed by the rhododendron bush, and I thought nothing of it at the time. People were moving about quite freely, but now, knowing that Geoffrey's glass was sitting there unattended. This detail struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. The selective nature of the poisoning had always suggested intimate knowledge of Dr. Haydock's habits, and here was confirmation that someone had indeed approached the critical location during the crucial moment of distraction. Her subsequent visit to Miss Hartnell proved equally illuminating, though in ways that complicated rather than simplified the emerging picture. The schoolmistress received her in a sitting room that reflected its owner's character with mathematical precision. Everything arranged with rigid order, moral treatises prominently displayed, and a faint scent of violet water that immediately recalled the anonymous letters. Miss Hartnell's demeanor remained composed, despite the obvious strain, her responses measured and entirely credible when questioned about her movements during the party. "Inspector Slack's investigation has been most thorough," Miss Hartnell declared, her voice carrying 30 years of educational authority. "Though I find his focus on young Radford somewhat hasty. The boy is clearly troubled, but trouble does not necessarily indicate guilt." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, the way Miss Hartnell neither confirmed nor denied her involvement in the anonymous correspondence. When the conversation turned to Dr. Haydock's recent disagreements with various villagers, Miss Hartnell's moral indignation became apparent. The doctor's willingness to bend established protocols troubled me greatly, she admitted with obvious reluctance. His compassionate intentions were admirable, but one cannot allow sentiment to override scientific fact and moral obligation. The vaccination dispute was merely the most recent example of his concerning flexibility regarding proper procedures. The schoolroom itself provided additional insights into Miss Hartnell's capabilities and resources. Her botanical specimens cabinet stood partially open, revealing carefully labeled packets of various plant materials, including Aconitum napellus, with its string tied in a precise square knot that spoke of methodical handling. The typewriter in her small office produced the distinctive jumping E that matched the anonymous letters, while the violet-scented blotting paper and blue ink from Jameson's pharmacy completed the circumstantial evidence linking her to the threatening correspondence. Yet Miss Hartnell's alibi for the crucial period remained unshakable. Too many reliable witnesses had observed her continuous presence during the garden party, making it impossible for her to have contaminated Dr. Haydock's glass. The distinction between writing threatening letters and committing murder was becoming increasingly clear, suggesting a more complex conspiracy than Inspector Slack had initially envisioned. The afternoon brought dramatic developments that would shift the investigation's focus once again. A second anonymous letter arrived at the police station, its violet scent and distinctive typeface, immediately recognizable. The message was particularly taunting. The poison was applied to a particular glass, placed conveniently upon the face of time, whose very figure would point to guilt if only men would look. The reference to the sundial was unmistakable, yet this letter bore an even typeface, suggesting it had been composed on a different machine entirely. Inspector Slack's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, a search of Timothy's lodgings had uncovered a bottle of violet essence, blue ink from Jameson's pharmacy, and most damning of all, a chemist's paper twist bearing faint traces of medicinal odor. The young man's protestations of innocence seemed increasingly hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Yet Miss Marple found herself drawn to examine Timothy's character more closely. A private conversation with the distraught young man revealed layers of complexity that the official investigation had overlooked. His secretive medical consultations, she learned, concerned not personal shame, but a family matter of considerable delicacy. "Miss Marple," Timothy confided, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "Dr. Haydock was helping me resolve a financial irregularity in my father's business affairs. Nothing criminal, you understand, but something that could have destroyed his reputation if it became public knowledge. The blue stains on my fingers come from copying documents, trying to set things right before anyone discovered the discrepancy." This revelation cast Timothy's suspicious behavior in an entirely different light. His protective gestures toward his left wrist concealed not evidence of guilt, but a family signet ring that bore significance to the matter Dr. Haydock had been helping him resolve. His obvious distress stemmed from fear of exposure rather than consciousness of murder. As evening approached, the village's collective certainty began to show cracks. The discovery that someone had broken into the schoolhouse and stolen Miss Hartnell's typewriter created new questions about the timeline and the killer's methods. The theft had been carefully staged to look like the work of a desperate criminal trying to destroy evidence, yet Miss Marple noted that the glass fragments lay more outside than inside the window, suggesting the break-in had been orchestrated from within. Standing in the violated schoolroom, Miss Marple observed the behavior of those who had gathered to assess the damage. Mr. Fortescue's prompt arrival and efficient sympathy struck her as noteworthy, particularly his careful handling of the scattered papers and his immediate offer to fund repairs through the bank. When he straightened the desk blotter, a narrow slip of paper fell to the floor, a fountain pen testing strip bearing the bank's letterhead, and a faint smear of blue ink, scented with violet. The implications were becoming clear to Miss Marple's experienced eye. Someone was orchestrating an elaborate deception, using Miss Hartnell's genuine moral outrage and anonymous letters as cover for a more calculated crime. The true killer possessed intimate knowledge of village dynamics, access to various locations, and the sophistication to plant evidence while appearing to assist the investigation. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception that had been woven around Dr. Haydock's death. The case against Timothy was certainly compelling on the surface, but it possessed the fatal flaw of being too perfectly constructed. The real murderer remained hidden among them, protected by the very investigation that should have exposed them, using the community's rush to judgment as perfect camouflage for their calculated evil. The truth lay not in the obvious clues pointing toward young Timothy Radford, but in the subtle inconsistencies that revealed a more calculating mind at work. Someone who understood that the most effective lies were built upon foundations of partial truth, and that the most dangerous criminals often wore the masks of helpful, law-abiding citizens. The grey dawn that settled over St. Mary Mead carried with it an atmosphere of impending resolution that made the village collectively hold its breath. Inspector Slack's satisfaction had crystallized into absolute certainty overnight, and word had already spread through Mrs. Price's shop that Timothy Radford would be formally charged before the morning was through. Miss Marple observed this rush toward closure with the quiet unease of someone who had learned that truth rarely presented itself in such tidy packages, particularly when the evidence seemed almost too perfectly arranged to support a single, convenient conclusion. The urgent knocking at her cottage door just after 7 o'clock brought the vicar and Griselda, both bearing the strained expressions of people who had wrestled with conscience through a sleepless night. Leonard Clement's clerical composure had cracked under the weight of watching an innocent young man march toward destruction, while Griselda clutched her shawl with white-knuckled determination. "Miss Marple," the vicar began without preamble, "Inspector Slack means to charge Timothy this morning. He believes the second anonymous letter proves what he calls the boy's guilty desperation. But Griselda has remembered something that troubles us both." Griselda's voice trembled slightly as she explained. "Yesterday afternoon, when I was still too shaken to think clearly, Mr. Fortescue offered to help with the aftermath. He was so considerate, he even took the crystal punch bowl into the dining room and washed it himself, saying he couldn't bear to see it standing there as a reminder of Geoffrey's death. At the time, I was grateful for his thoughtfulness, but now?" Miss Marple's mild blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Now you wonder why someone would be so eager to cleanse something that contained no poison, my dear. People do sometimes scrub what they never soiled, particularly when they wish to ensure that no trace of their involvement can ever be discovered." Before the vicar could respond, the distant sound of running footsteps echoed through the morning mist. Constable Polk appeared at the garden gate, his bicycle lamp still glowing in the grey light, his face bearing the particular pallor of someone who had discovered far more than he had bargained for during a routine patrol. "Vicar, Miss Marple," he called breathlessly. "There's been another break-in. Dr. Haydock's surgery this time. Window smashed, papers everywhere, and Mrs. Weatherby in a terrible state. Inspector Slacks sent me to fetch you immediately." The surgery presented a scene of calculated chaos that immediately struck Miss Marple as both more and less than it appeared. Light poured through the shattered window in jagged patterns, illuminating a room where drawers gaped open and papers lay scattered with theatrical precision. Yet her experienced eye noted the selective nature of the destruction. The safe stood untouched, valuable medical instruments remained undisturbed, and the chaos seemed concentrated around the desk area where personal records would be kept. Mrs. Weatherby sat rigidly by the fireplace, her composure maintained through sheer force of will, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the effort required. Inspector Slack surveyed the damage with grim satisfaction, already constructing a narrative that would fit his predetermined conclusion. "Typical behavior of a desperate criminal," he declared. "Young Radford growing bold, or perhaps seeking to destroy evidence that might further incriminate him. Though Constable Briggs confirms the boy was under observation at his lodgings from 7 o'clock onward." Miss Marple examined the broken window with particular attention, noting how the glass fragments lay predominantly outside rather than within the room. "Inspector, might I observe that this pattern suggests the window was broken from inside rather than by someone forcing entry? Someone who possessed a key, perhaps, or who was regularly admitted to the premises?" Mrs. Weatherby's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a steadiness that barely concealed profound realization. "I can tell you exactly what's missing, Inspector. Jeffrey's small black ledger where he kept personal records of financial arrangements with patients. Loans he'd extended, payments he'd accepted in kind, the sort of private kindnesses that don't appear in official accounts. Also his prescription daybook. Everything else has been disturbed, but those 2 items are gone." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the fireplace, where grey ash bore the distinctive pattern of papers that had been burned in careful sequence. A faint sweetness lingered in the air, not the medicinal scents one would expect in a doctor's surgery, but something more delicate that reminded her of the violet essence found in Timothy's lodgings. Near the art desk, she observed a pale rectangle where the missing ledger had sat for years, its absence creating a brighter ghost against the sun-faded wood. Mr. Fortescue's arrival struck her as remarkably prompt for someone who had not been summoned. He appeared in the doorway with his hat in hand and an expression of perfectly calibrated concern, immediately offering assistance while apologizing for any intrusion. His instinctive movement toward the scattered papers, straightening them with a banker's methodical precision, allowed him to survey the damage while appearing merely helpful. "Mrs. Weatherby, when Constable Polk raced past the bank, I feared some further misfortune had befallen you," he said with practiced sympathy. "Inspector, please say if I'm in the way, but I thought I might be of service in organizing any financial documents that shouldn't be misplaced." As he bent to collect the papers, Miss Marple observed how a narrow strip slipped from beneath the desk blotter, no more than a pen-testing scrap, but one that bore faint streaks of blue ink and carried, to those near enough to detect it, a whisper of violet scent. Mr. Fortescue didn't notice its fall, but Miss Marple did, and she quietly secured it while the others focused on Inspector Slack's increasingly confident pronouncements about Timothy's guilt. The revelation that would transform the entire investigation came when Mrs. Weatherby, gathering courage from Miss Marple's gentle encouragement, produced a small wooden box that had belonged to her late husband. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper with the care reserved for precious things, lay additional anonymous letters of increasing venom and, most crucially, a detailed record of Dr. Haydock's private financial dealings with various villagers. "Jeffrey kept meticulous documentation," she explained through barely controlled emotion. "He was so distressed by those accusations that he recorded every transaction, every consultation, every penny that passed through his hands. He said if anyone questioned his integrity, he would have complete proof of his ethical conduct." The records painted a disturbing picture of Dr. Haydock's role as an informal banker for the community, extending credit during difficult periods and accepting unusual collateral arrangements. Most significantly, Mr. Fortescue appeared frequently in these pages, not as a patient, but as someone who had borrowed substantial sums against expected inheritance that had failed to materialize. The doctor's growing concern about the bank manager's ability to meet his obligations was evident in increasingly urgent notations, culminating in a final entry dated 3 days before the garden party. "CF situation untenable. Must demand immediate settlement of all outstanding obligations. Cannot continue to enable what appears to be systematic deception." This revelation cast Dr. Haydock's jubilant mood at the party in an entirely new light. Rather than facing exposure himself, he had, been preparing to demand accountability from someone who had taken advantage of his generosity. His financial arrangements with Mr. Fortescue at the bank had been designed not to resolve his own debts, but to position himself to call in loans that could destroy the bank manager's carefully constructed facade of respectability. Miss Marple's methodical mind began assembling the true sequence of events with crystalline clarity. Mr. Fortescue's helpful presence throughout the garden party had provided perfect cover for observing Dr. Haydock's habits and accessing his drinking glass during the crucial moment of Colonel Bantry's toast. His subsequent involvement in the investigation had allowed him to plant evidence against Timothy while appearing to assist the authorities, using his knowledge of village finances to select the perfect scapegoat, a young man whose genuine family difficulties made him appear guilty of something. The theft of Miss Hartnell's typewriter had served a dual purpose. It suggested that the anonymous letter writer was desperately trying to destroy evidence, while simultaneously explaining why subsequent letters would bear a different typeface. The second letter, with its specific reference to the sundial's face of time, had been composed on the bank's modern Remington to direct suspicion firmly toward Timothy, while the consistent violet scent provided the only thread connecting the genuine moral outrage of Miss Hartnell's correspondence to the calculated misdirection of Mr. Fortescue's manipulation. As the morning wore on and Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the peculiar psychology of a killer who could orchestrate such elaborate deception while maintaining the facade of civic responsibility. Mr. Fortescue had not acted in sudden desperation, but had planned each detail with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to managing complex financial arrangements, using the village's natural tendency toward helpful gossip and moral certainty as perfect camouflage for murder most calculated and cold-blooded. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to discover that its most helpful and respectable citizen was capable of crimes that went far beyond simple embezzlement, and that the true test of Miss Marple's understanding would come in exposing a killer who had made the fatal mistake of believing that small-town kindness could be manipulated as easily as a bank ledger. The grey afternoon that followed the surgery break-in found Miss Marple in a contemplative mood as she sat in the vicarage drawing-room, ostensibly offering comfort to Griselda, but in reality preparing for what she recognized would be the crucial test of her theory. The evidence against Timothy Radford had reached such overwhelming proportions that even Inspector Slack's natural skepticism had been thoroughly convinced, yet the very perfection of the case troubled her deeply. In her long experience with human nature, genuine guilt rarely announced itself with such theatrical precision, and she had learned to be most suspicious when all the pieces fell into place with mathematical exactitude. The soft knock at the vicarage door brought exactly the visitor she had been expecting, though she was careful to appear surprised when Mr. Fortescue entered with his customary air of helpful concern. His timing struck her as remarkably convenient, arriving just as she sat apparently defenseless, with nothing more than her knitting and the gentle reputation that had served her so well in previous investigations. He carried white lilies for Griselda and wore the expression of a man genuinely distressed by the community's tragedy, though Miss Marple noted with interest how his eyes swept the room with the assessing gaze of someone cataloguing both emotional and material assets. "Miss Marple, how good to see you," he greeted her with practiced warmth, settling into the chair she indicated with apparent casualness. "Such a dreadful business with young Radford. One tries to be helpful, of course, but the sheer malevolence of it all quite beggars belief. Inspector Slack seems confident that justice will be served swiftly." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she studied his composed features. "Indeed, Mr. Fortescue, though I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of the crime. The selective nature of the poisoning, for instance, only Dr. Haydock affected despite everyone drinking from the same source. It suggests such intimate knowledge of his habits, particularly his tendency to return to the same glass rather than taking a fresh one." For just a moment, something flickered behind Fortescue's carefully maintained expression, a brief tightening around his eyes that suggested her observation had struck closer to truth than he found comfortable. A tragic coincidence, surely, though I suppose Timothy would have observed the doctor's habits during their various consultations. Ah, yes, those consultations, Miss Marple continued mildly, her needles clicking with methodical precision. Though I understand from Mrs. Weatherby that Dr. Haydock had recently resolved his financial difficulties through some fortunate arrangements, he seemed quite relieved about settling certain outstanding obligations. Strange that someone facing exposure would appear so jubilant, don't you think? The calculated pause that followed her question revealed more than any immediate response might have. Mr. Fortescue's composure remained admirably intact, yet she detected the subtle tension of someone operating under considerable strain, each word being carefully weighed before utterance. Geoffrey had always been somewhat irregular in his record-keeping, he replied smoothly. The bank was pleased to help him consolidate various informal arrangements into more conventional terms, though I fear his generosity may have been taken advantage of by those less scrupulous than himself. Miss Marple noted how skillfully he deflected from the specific nature of those arrangements, while simultaneously reinforcing suspicion against Timothy, such as the missing ledger from his surgery, perhaps. One would think a desperate criminal would simply destroy such evidence rather than risk carrying it away. Unless, Fortescue suggested with apparent reasonableness, the contents implicated him so directly that destruction seemed insufficient. Some secrets require more careful management than simple elimination. The psychological insight revealed in this response struck Miss Marple as particularly illuminating. His intimate understanding of how incriminating evidence might be handled suggested someone who had given considerable thought to such matters, while his ready explanation indicated preparation for exactly this line of questioning. I was particularly struck by the second anonymous letter, she continued, her voice carrying the gentle persistence that had unraveled so many carefully constructed deceptions. The one with its poetic reference to the sundial. The face of time would point to guilt. Such a clever touch, drawing attention to the very spot where the crime was committed while appearing to accuse the victim himself. At this observation, Mr. Fortescue's hand, which had been reaching for his teacup, paused almost imperceptibly before completing the motion. Rather macabre poetry, certainly, though it only reinforces the inspector's theory about Timothy's desperate attempts at misdirection. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Though the typeface was different from Miss Hartnell's machine, wasn't it? And then there's the matter of that crystal punch bowl. Griselda mentioned how thoughtfully you cleaned it yourself, saying you couldn't bear to see it standing as a reminder of Geoffrey's death. Such consideration, though one might wonder why someone would be so eager to cleanse something that contained no poison. The effect of this seemingly innocent observation was immediate and telling. Mr. Fortescue's carefully maintained composure flickered visibly, a brief crack in the facade that revealed something cold and calculating beneath. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his teacup, the delicate china rattling against the saucer with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning disguised as concern. "You're venturing into dangerous speculation. The police have a clear case, and I believe we should allow them to pursue it without unnecessary complications." But Miss Marple had observed the critical reaction she had been waiting for, the moment when a guilty man's confidence cracked under the weight of specific, undeniable knowledge. The punch bowl detail, witnessed only by Griselda and the vicar, had revealed exactly what she needed to know about Mr. Fortescue's intimate involvement in the crime's aftermath. "Sometimes," she replied with serene certainty, "the most necessary complications are precisely what lead us to truth. Just as a small detail, like washing evidence with rather too much zeal, can reveal a great deal about someone's true relationship to a crime." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the vicarage garden, Miss Marple recognized that the psychological trap had been successfully sprung. Mr. Fortescue's mask of helpful respectability had slipped just enough to confirm her deductions, and she knew that his desperation would soon drive him to actions that would provide the concrete evidence Inspector Slack required. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned, often possessed a fatal flaw. The very confidence that enabled them to commit elaborate crimes also led them to believe they could manipulate any situation to their advantage, even when that situation had been carefully designed to expose their guilt. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to discover that its most helpful and respectable citizen was capable of murder most calculated and cold-blooded, and that the true test of Miss Marple's understanding lay not in solving the crime, but in proving it to those who preferred the comfort of obvious answers to the complexity of hidden truth. The afternoon light filtering through the vicarage windows cast long shadows across the drawing room as Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence, her knitting needles motionless for once as she considered the delicate timing required for the next phase of her investigation. Mr. Fortescue's departure had left behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken recognition. The psychological trap had been successfully sprung, revealing the crucial crack in his carefully maintained facade. But she knew from long experience that cornering a desperate criminal often made them most dangerous. "My dear Vicar," she said quietly to Leonard Clement, who stood by the window watching Mr. Fortescue's retreating figure with obvious distress, "we must now provide our quarry with an irresistible opportunity to reveal himself completely. Inspector Slack will require more than psychological observations to abandon his case against Timothy, no matter how compelling our deductions may be." Griselda, still pale from the realization that they had been entertaining a murderer in their home, moved closer to her husband with unconscious need for comfort. "Miss Marple, surely we must warn Inspector Slack immediately. If Mr. Fortescue is indeed the killer, Timothy could be formally charged within hours for a crime he didn't commit." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held a steely determination that those who knew her well had learned to respect. "We shall indeed inform the inspector, but we must first ensure that Mr. Fortescue provides us with the concrete evidence that will make our case irrefutable. A guilty man's confidence, my dear, often proves his ultimate undoing, particularly when that confidence leads him to believe he can manipulate any situation to his advantage." The plan she outlined was deceptively simple, relying on the most powerful force in village life, gossip carefully directed and strategically deployed. Mrs. Weatherby would be invited to bring Dr. Haydock's remaining personal effects to the vicarage for safekeeping, including a leather portfolio that had been overlooked during the surgery break-in. Word would be allowed to circulate, through the reliable channels of Mrs. Price's shop and the post office, that among these effects was Dr. Haydock's missing private ledger, discovered tucked inside an old medical journal and containing detailed records of all his financial arrangements with various villagers. "The beauty of truth, my dear Griselda, is that it requires no embellishment to be compelling," Miss Marple explained as they prepared their careful deception. "We need only suggest that such evidence exists, and our murderer will feel compelled to secure or destroy it. His desperation will provide us with the proof Inspector Slack requires." By tea time, the carefully planted rumor had traveled through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of a well-organized postal system. Mrs. Bantry, dispatched to collect some unnecessary items from Mrs. Price's shop, let slip the news with exactly the right mixture of concern and discretion. The village baker's wife mentioned it to the postman, who shared it with the constable, who naturally felt obligated to inform Inspector Slack of this potentially significant development. Mr. Fortescue's reaction to the circulating gossip was everything Miss Marple had hoped for and more. His inquiries, made with the careful casualness of a professional banker assessing risk, reached the vicarage through 3 different sources within the hour. His offer to assist with cataloguing any financial documents, made through the respectable channel of his concern for proper estate management, revealed the calculated desperation of someone who understood exactly what such records might contain. The evening brought Mrs. Weatherby to the vicarage, carrying a worn leather portfolio that did indeed contain Dr. Haydock's most sensitive financial records. The documents painted a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation extending far beyond simple embezzlement. Dr. Haydock had been methodically documenting a sophisticated scheme in which Mr. Fortescue had used his position at the bank to identify vulnerable villagers, then approached the generous physician with carefully crafted requests for assistance that gradually transformed him into an unwitting accomplice in increasingly questionable financial arrangements. Geoffrey discovered 3 weeks ago that several of the borrowers Clement had recommended were actually fictitious, Mrs. Weatherby explained, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. Names and addresses that existed only on paper, with the money ultimately flowing back to Fortescue through various intermediaries. Geoffrey was building a case that would have exposed not just embezzlement, but fraud on a scale that could have destroyed the bank's reputation. Miss Marple examined the meticulous records with growing admiration for Dr. Haydock's thoroughness and growing horror at the systematic nature of the deception. The doctor's jubilant mood at the garden party now made perfect sense. Not relief at resolving his own difficulties, but satisfaction at finally having enough evidence to demand complete accountability from someone who had systematically abused his trust and generosity. Colonel Bantry, summoned to assist with security arrangements, positioned himself strategically in the vicarage study, while Constable Polk, briefed on the situation despite Inspector Slack's continued skepticism, maintained a discreet watch from the kitchen garden. The stage was set for what Miss Marple privately considered the final test of Mr. Fortescue's character. Would his desperation drive him to actions that would provide irrefutable proof of his guilt? They did not have long to wait. At 11:30, when the village had settled into its customary quiet, the careful pressure of someone testing the side door latch announced their visitor's arrival. Mr. Fortescue entered with the confident movements of someone who possessed legitimate access, his familiarity with the vicarage layout evident in the way he navigated the darkened hallway without hesitation. Miss Marple, positioned where she could observe without being seen, noted with professional interest how he moved directly to the study and the desk where the portfolio supposedly lay hidden. His actions revealed intimate knowledge of how such documents might be concealed. Lifting the blotter, checking for false bottoms in drawers, examining the spaces where important papers were typically secreted. The methodical precision of his search spoke of someone who had given considerable thought to such matters. The confrontation, when it came, was both more and less dramatic than anyone had anticipated. Timothy Radford, who had broken his promise to remain safely at his lodgings, appeared in the study doorway with the desperate courage of someone who had finally recognized that innocence required active defense rather than passive hope. "What are you doing here?" Timothy demanded, his voice thin but determined. "Put that down immediately." The brief struggle that followed was more revealing than violent. Mr. Fortescue's reaction was swift and practiced, suggesting someone who had prepared for the possibility of discovery. As he attempted to escape through the French windows, a crucial piece of evidence was torn loose, a silver cufflink bearing the bank's distinctive crest, which skittered across the floor to rest beneath the writing desk. Colonel Bantry's military reflexes and Constable Polk's determined pursuit prevented any actual escape, though Mr. Fortescue managed to reach the garden gate before being apprehended. The leather portfolio he had been attempting to steal contained not Dr. Haydock's genuine records, but a carefully prepared selection of routine correspondence and innocuous financial documents, sufficient to appear valuable to someone desperate to possess them, but harmless if examined by authorities. Inspector Slack's arrival, summoned from his bed and his certainty, brought the evening's events full circle. His examination of the silver cufflink, with its distinctive bank crest and faint traces of violet essence, provided the physical evidence that transformed psychological deduction into legal proof. The attempted burglary, combined with the systematic financial fraud revealed in Dr. Haydock's genuine records, created a compelling alternative narrative that even his professional pride could not ignore. As dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, the village found itself confronting the disturbing reality that its most helpful and respectable citizen had been capable of murder, most calculated and cold-blooded. The peaceful facade of community trust had been shattered, revealing the desperate greed that could hide behind masks of civic responsibility and financial respectability. Miss Marple, observing the proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served through patience and careful observation, reflected on the peculiar psychology of criminals who believed their intelligence and careful planning made them invulnerable to detection. Mr. Fortescue's fatal flaw had been his assumption that small-town kindness and trust could be manipulated as easily as a bank ledger, never recognizing that the very community he had deceived possessed its own forms of wisdom and protection. The stage was now set for the final revelation, where all the carefully gathered threads of evidence and deduction would be woven together into an irrefutable tapestry of truth that would free an innocent young man and expose the calculated evil that had masqueraded as helpful respectability in their peaceful English village. The pale morning light filtering through the vicarage windows seemed to carry with it a sense of resolution as the principal figures in Dr. Haydock's murder gathered in Griselda's drawing room. Inspector Slack, his professional pride somewhat restored but his confidence thoroughly chastened, sat opposite Miss Marple with the grudging respect of someone who had learned not to underestimate elderly ladies with knitting needles. Timothy Radford occupied a chair near the window, his face bearing the exhausted relief of someone who had glimpsed the gallows and stepped back from the brink, while Mrs. Weatherby clutched her late husband's leather portfolio with the determination of someone finally ready to see justice served. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting with characteristic precision, her mild blue eyes surveying the assembled company with the gentle authority that had served her so well in previous investigations. The beauty of this particular crime, she began in her soft, clear voice, lay not in its complexity but in its elegant simplicity. Mr. Fortescue understood that the most effective deceptions are built upon foundations of truth, and he possessed the patience to construct his plan over an extended period, using the natural rhythms of village life as perfect camouflage for calculated murder. She paused to allow her words to settle, noting how Inspector Slack leaned forward with reluctant attention. The key to understanding Dr. Haydock's death lay in recognizing that it was not a crime of passion or sudden desperation, but the culmination of systematic fraud that threatened to destroy Mr. Fortescue's carefully constructed respectability. Geoffrey had discovered that several borrowers recommended by the bank manager were entirely fictitious, with funds ultimately flowing back to Mr. Fortescue through various intermediaries. The doctor's jubilant mood at the garden party reflected not relief at resolving his own difficulties, but satisfaction at finally having enough evidence to demand complete accountability. Timothy's voice, when he spoke, carried the tremor of someone who had wrestled with secrets too heavy for his years. Dr. Haydock was helping my family untangle some unfortunate investments made through Mr. Fortescue's recommendations, Miss Marple. He was documenting everything, saying we needed proper records to protect ourselves. Exactly so, my dear boy, Miss Marple replied with maternal warmth. Your genuine distress and secretive behavior made you an ideal scapegoat for someone who understood how guilt and innocence are perceived in small communities. Mr. Fortescue's fatal error was assuming that human kindness could be manipulated as easily as financial records. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. Miss Marple, the evidence against young Radford seemed overwhelming. How did Fortescue manage such convincing deception while appearing to assist our investigation? Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she explained the psychological sophistication of the crime. Mr. Fortescue possessed several crucial advantages: intimate knowledge of village finances, access to various properties through his professional duties, and most importantly, the natural tendency of helpful citizens to assist during crises. His involvement in the investigation provided perfect cover for planting evidence while appearing to support the authorities. The technical aspects of the murder revealed themselves with crystalline clarity as she continued. The selective nature of the poisoning demonstrated intimate knowledge of Dr. Haydock's habits, particularly his tendency to return to the same glass on the sundial rather than taking a fresh one from the tray. During Colonel Bantry's toast, when everyone's attention was focused elsewhere, Mr. Fortescue contaminated that single glass, knowing Geoffrey would instinctively reclaim it. Mrs. Weatherby's sharp intake of breath marked her recognition of the calculated cruelty involved. He used Geoffrey's own kindness against him, didn't he? The very predictability that made him such a good doctor made him vulnerable to someone who had studied his habits. Precisely, my dear, Miss Marple confirmed. The anonymous letters provided additional camouflage, with Miss Hartnell's genuine moral outrage serving as cover for Mr. Fortescue's more calculated correspondence. He purchased aconitine, violet essence, and blue ink from Jameson's pharmacy, using gloves and paying cash to avoid detection, then planted these materials in Timothy's lodgings during his helpful visits. The psychological manipulation extended far beyond the immediate crime, she explained. The crystal punch bowl's zealous cleaning revealed someone desperate to eliminate trace evidence from a container that held no poison, while the staged break-in served dual purposes, destroying incriminating financial records while creating additional suspicion against Timothy. The most dangerous criminals, Miss Marple observed as the morning progressed, are often those who believe their intelligence and careful planning make them invulnerable to detection. Mr. Fortescue's downfall came through the very tidiness that enabled his crimes. His compulsive need to straighten papers, clean surfaces, and maintain perfect order, even when such behavior revealed his intimate involvement in events he claimed merely to witness. The silver cufflink discovered during his attempted theft had provided the final piece of physical evidence, bearing both the bank's distinctive crest and traces of the violet essence used to connect Timothy to the anonymous letters. Combined with Dr. Haydock's genuine financial records, it created an irrefutable case that even Inspector Slack's professional pride could not ignore. As the gathering began to disperse, Timothy approached Miss Marple with obvious gratitude. "How can I ever thank you for seeing through such elaborate deception when everyone else was convinced of my guilt?" Miss Marple's response carried the gentle wisdom of someone who had observed human nature in all its complexity for more than 7 decades. "We protect ourselves from such calculated evil, my dear boy, by remembering that trust must be earned through consistent behavior rather than assumed through social position. The capacity for both good and evil exists in every human heart, and our safety lies not in naive faith, but in careful observation of how people treat those who cannot benefit them. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead would heal from its encounter with systematic deception, though it would carry subtle scars as reminders that evil often wore familiar faces. Miss Marple returned to her cottage garden, her knitting needles clicking with satisfied rhythm, reflecting on the eternal struggle between those who would exploit human kindness and those who would protect it. The summer garden party that had begun in innocent celebration had revealed the darker currents flowing beneath even the most tranquil communities, but it had also demonstrated the power of patient observation and gentle persistence to expose truth and protect the innocent from the poison that could seep into any peaceful heart.